Hello, it's Chino here. If you like aggressive openings, you're in the right place. Today, I want to explore how to play against the English opening with black. The English opening, after c4, kind of signals white's intention to avoid some of the main defenses for black in the queen's pawn game. Um, in the past, I've tried several approaches for black. I've tried pawn to f5, to try and transpose to a Dutch. I've even tried knight to f6. But lately, after looking at a few games by Zinzi Chashvili, the Russian American Grandmaster, I'm convinced that e5 is the most principled response to the English opening c4. Okay, in this game, in this video, I will go through one of my games where I've experimented with this pawn to e5. And in this particular occasion, it turned out very well for me. So this was a club game where my opponent, playing the white pieces, continued knight to c3. I continued with the standard knight to f6. And now knight to f3. Now this move, knight to f3, threatens to capture the e5 pawn. E4 is possible, but it's a little bit committal and doesn't quite suit my style, so I just played simply knight to c6, which happens to be the better move recommended by theory to defend the e5 pawn. Now in this position, typically white can play pawn to e4, can even play pawn to e3, or even pawn to g3. There's so many ways for white to play, but a curious one, which my opponent adopted, was pawn to a3. And the whole idea of this move is to prevent a bishop to b4 move, which would be played after, say, something like g3, for example. Now, when he played pawn to a3, I was caught off guard because I hadn't analyzed this variation before. It already takes away my plan of bishop to b4, and it also threatens to play pawn to b4 in some lines, to try and gain some space on the queen side. So in this position, I thought for a long time, and I thought, well, why not continue with the principled continuation? And the principled continuation in a lot of chess positions, particularly in the opening, is to try and play in the center, particularly when your opponent makes a move on the flank. It's always a good idea to play in the center, so I played pawn to d5. Now, after the standard pawn takes d5, couldn't see anything else for white, and knight takes d5, we reach another important point. Now, this position's occurred, according to my database, has occurred quite a few times. And the main continuation here for white would usually be to play something like queen to c2. And if you notice, with the queen on c2, black can't really threaten the queen, because this b4 square is taken away from the knight. Another try in this position is pawn to d3, and even e3 is possible. But the interesting thing is none of these continuations cause black any problems, which leads me to think that maybe this a3 move is not the most testing for black. Anyway, in the game, my opponent played e4, which is another main line. And here I had to think again. My first thought was to play knight to f6, but I'm glad I didn't play it because after analyzing with the engines later on, I realized that after a move like bishop to b5, there's already pressure on the c5 pawn, and after bishop to d6, white can just play pawn to d4 with an advantage. So yeah, I didn't play that. So let's just go back to the position after e4. And so after e4, into the knight to f6, I thought, well, how about knight to f4? And apparently this is the main line. But I discounted it because I was afraid of this move, pawn to d4. But it turns out that in practice, black gets a playable position and even has a better record in some of the important games in my database. For example, after pawn takes d4, threatening to win the knight on c3, and bishop takes f4, and pawn takes c3, queen takes d8, knight takes d8, pawn takes d3, and knight to e6. And we have a position where there have been quite a few exchanges, and it should be equal. But I think black has some long-term ideas, particularly to play against this isolated pawn on c3. So yeah, this is the well-known equalizing continuation, which I was unaware of during the game. Hence why I discounted um, this idea of playing knight to f4. And what I did think of in the game was to try and transpose to a reverse Sicilian, where black, where you get this sort of position after knight takes c3 and pawn takes c3. Well, this is what I played, and now bishop to d6, where you get a kind of reverse Taimanov type position in the Sicilian. And I was happy to play play like this. I mean, if you had the colors reversed, this would be the white pieces with this sort of setup, against black with this sort of setup. I was quite happy to play this position. Now, in this position, I expected white to probably go pawn to d4, trying to grab space in the center. But here came the first surprise, bishop to b5. And there's nothing particularly wrong with this move. And I mean, for one, it threatens to double my pawns. Although that would be a strategic mistake because in return for the double pawns, black would end up with the bishop pair in a relatively open position. That's usually a good advantage for the side with the two bishops. So after bishop to b5, I just ignored it and played castle's king side. So now I've come out the pin from this bishop. And my king's stocked away in the corner, and I'm ready to, think about how best to place my pieces. Okay, white castle in this position, like I said, bishop takes c6 is not a good idea, because this position with the two bishops should be better. Yeah, should be better for black. Okay, so just going back to that position, white didn't go for bishop takes c6 and correctly played castle kingside. But again, maybe d4 would have been interesting. Or if white didn't want to be committal, even the move pawn to d3 would have been a reasonable move. But here he castled kingside, which is fine. And now I thought, okay, how best to continue. f5 came to mind, but it felt a bit too loosening. And so I thought, well, why not take advantage of this pin, on this d1 to h5 diagonal, and by playing bishop to g4. And apparently the computers thought I could have played queen to f6 or queen to e7 in this position. But I played a natural looking move, bishop to g4. And the point is, it's kind of awkward for white to meet. I mean, to get the queen out of this pin, white would have to retreat with bishop to e2, or play pawn to h3 followed by g4, which is a bit too weakening. And we'll see how that plays out in the game. So h3, And yeah, in this position, I simply pull the bishop back to h5. There's no point trying to resolve the pin just yet. With bishop takes f3, and now white continued bishop to e2, and to try and get rid of the pin. But just one, I just need to point out something here. Um, g4, like I said before, would be a not such a great move, because after bishop to g6, I mean this position around the king is a bit loose. I mean, a computer might tell you white's doing all right, but I mean, yeah, in a game between humans, I mean, this is a big psychological disadvantage, because at some point black's gonna try h5 to try and loosen the squares around the king. Okay, so this bishop to g6, you know, h3, g4, bishop to g6. I don't think is such a good continuation for white. I mean, he could continue rook to e1, but yeah, I mean, after it was like f6, etc., black still will end up with a good game. All right, so just going back to the position after bishop to h5. So instead of playing this pawn to g4 move, white played bishop to e2, just to come out the pin. Reasonable move. I played a simple developing move, queen to e7. And I think this is a point where white starts to stray a little bit. I mean, one idea would have been to simply play pawn to d3, and develop slowly. Think about rook to b1 at some point. Or even just something simple like knight to h2 to try and exchange bishops. But yeah, this is where white starts to stray a little bit and plays queen to b3. Now, at first glance, you might think, well, what's wrong with this move? Because the queen's hitting this b7 square. So the queen develops and attacks something at the same time. Um, but the problem is this doesn't really cause, the queen's a bit misplaced on the queen's side, and doesn't really cause black too many problems. I mean, if anything, white's white's knight is tied down on f3 because of this bishop takes e2 threat. So in this position, I simply played rook a to b8 to defend the b7 pawn. But I mean, computer analysis shows even stronger would have been to play knight to a5. Something I didn't really consider because I'm not a big fan of leaving the knight on the rim, and I couldn't see a continuation after something like a straightforward continuation after something like queen to a4. So anyway, I played rook a to b8, and here I think white continues to stray. So bishop to b2. I mean, again, d3 was called for in this position, and to be able to develop the bishop to e3 on that, to a more natural square. But bishop to b2. And yeah, this is when I started to feel like maybe I'm starting to get a bit of an advantage, because this bishop on b2 is misplaced. It's not really, it might support a future pawn to d4, but that's not the best way to utilize a bishop. I mean, the bishop is on more or less like a pawn in that position. And so this is where I started to think, maybe, with all the white pieces going to the queen side, well, okay, the queen and the bishop and this rook still stuck here. Maybe I need to go for some kind of king side play. So I first played knight to d8, trying to reroute this knight to e6 so I can keep an eye on f4, for some kind of king side attack. That was the idea, at least. I played knight to d8, and then came another strange move, pawn to g3. Now, just before I continue with the game move, I mean, consistent with this bishop b2 move would have been the move pawn to d4, at least, trying to grab some space in the center. But yeah, I mean that would have led to. I mean, I still think black has an advantage, but at least black's trying to is being consistent. But anyway, after just taking going back one move, after knight to d8, and then came pawn to g3. Now the problem with this move is it creates even more weaknesses around the king. I guess the king was probably thinking about coming to g2, hence that move. But we'll see how this turns out. Knight to e6. So continuing with the plan of knight to d8 to e6. This knight's eyeing f4 and g5, and now king to g2. And here, this is where it starts to get interesting. I could play direct moves like knight to c5, threatening the queen, but after the queen moves, what's my plan? Well, I suppose I could play f5 in that position. But I thought, why not just go for the simple idea of king to h8, pawn to f5 with an attack. And let's see how this plays out. Rook A to e1 was played by white. Again, d4 would have been a good move in this, a reasonable move in this position, but rook A to e1, and I just simply continued f5. Now to the uninitiated, this looks like a blunder, particularly after pawn takes f5 and rook takes f5. It looks like a blunder because of this apparent fork. But the point here is that g4 would be a mistake. You know why? Take 30 seconds and see if you can find a continuation or a good continuation for black. Okay, well, I figured when I played rook takes f5 that if white were to continue pawn to g4, I figured I had knight to f4 check. And the point being that if the king moves, I don't know, say to h1, let's just say h1, knight takes e2 will follow. If pawn takes rook, then bishop takes knight. So white would have to play rook takes here. And after rook takes f3, and pawn takes h5, queen to h4 will just be crushing. So yeah, when you get some time, maybe you should analyze this in your spare time. So just going back to that key position after rook takes f5, we see that g4 is impossible because of this knight to f4 check. I mean, we looked at king to h1, but what if king to g3, for example? Well, I also figured that also knight takes e2 check, and then after rook takes e2, I also figured I had this check. And the point being, if king to g2, I've got this intermediate move check, winning the rook on e2. All right, so just going back to position after rook takes f5, we can see there's lots of tactics in black's favor after a move like pawn to g4. So my opponent correctly avoided this pawn to g4 move and tried something else. He tried knight to h4 with a double attack. So the knight's hitting the rook on f5 and the bishop's hitting the bishop on h5. But it turns out that this is still good for black. After the killer move, take a few seconds and see if you can find the strongest continuation for black. Okay, if you found it, congratulations. Knight to f4 check was a strong reply. And the whole idea is pawn takes knight is impossible because a queen takes h4 with a strong attack. So let's just show that on the board. Black scores strong attack. We're not going to waste any time on that. So after knight to f4 check, white correctly played king to h2. And here came the beautiful combination. Queen takes h4, double exclamation mark. And the point, which was again confirmation, was that after pawn takes h4, the white king is in a bit of a net because you see these two bishops, they're all pointing towards the black king. And we'll see how this one finished. Knight takes e2. I've gained some material back for that queen. So let's just do a count. So 2 rooks versus 2 rooks. At the moment, I've got 1 bishop for 1 bishop. At the moment, I've got bishop and knight for queen, which isn't enough. But the problem is there's a mating net around this king. We'll see. We'll see how this unfolds. Here, white played pawn to f3. But if you just take that back, let's look at some of the alternatives. Pawn to f4 to try and block this diagonal. That would simply have been met by pawn takes f4. And if king to h1 to come out the diagonal of this bishop, f3 would just have been crushing. I mean that king is in a difficult position because the knight can come to g3, and this rook can join the attack, on f8. So let's just look at a few moves. Queen to e6, for example, would simply be met by rook b to f8. And to be honest, white's position is terrible. I mean, there's all sorts that can happen here. There's knight to g3 check, there's pawn to f2, threats. There's all sorts of things going wrong here. Going wrong here for white. Anyway, just going back to the position after knight takes e2. If you look at rook takes e2, doesn't really work because after bishop takes e2, if king to g1, I mean, if the rook were to move, rook takes f2 is strong. So let's say rook here. Rook takes f2, check is strong. So something like this, king to g3 will be met by this with a mating net. And I'm not even going to spend time on that. So just going back. So in the game, after this knight takes e2, white didn't even bother with rook takes e2, bishop takes e2. He had just been giving away too much material. So he played pawn to f3 next instead. But yeah, this didn't really help. The finish, was instructive. Pawn to e4 check. The king moved, but let's say pawn to f4. That would have been met done by knight takes f4 with the discovered check coming next. I mean, and if rook takes f4, rook takes f4. This would just be a bit too much. I mean, this exposed king and the 2 bishops. Yeah, that'd be too much for white. So just going back after e4 check, he played king to g2. And then came pawn takes f3 check. And he didn't play the strongest continuation, but the point is the position's already lost. He played king to f2. But yeah, other moves would have lost as well. And then now simply after bishop to g3 check, and king had no other square to go but e3. Then came rook to e5 check, and after rook to d3, and bishop to g6 check, king to c4, and bishop to f7 check followed, king to b4. And here, I mean, Black played bishop takes b3, to try and gain a material advantage on one. But then even, which was good enough to win, but an even quicker continuation would have been pawn to a5 check. The point being that after king to a4 and bishop to e8 check, queen to b5, rook takes b5, would have just been game over. Anyway, just going back a few moves, after king to b4, instead of this pawn to a5 check, the game continued, bishop takes b3. And black went on to win. I mean, the material advantage is telling. I mean, king takes b3, and if you do a count here, you'll see that black's a piece up. Well, actually, more than a piece up after this exchange, this series of exchanges. So yeah, so this was an instructive game in the English Opening. So if we just do a quick recap. I think that after c4, a principal reply to the English Opening was e5, and if knight c3, just simple knight to f6. If knight to f3, knight to c6. And this a3 idea by white is a bit slow. I think if you're playing with the white pieces, you should consider playing one of the lines with either g3, e4, or maybe even e3. As we saw in the game, a good response to this a3 is pawn to d5. Sorry, just take that back. So a3 is pawn to d5. After the exchanges on d5. e4 is a bit too. Yeah, well, it's okay. I mean, black can equalize with knight to f5. But even the game continuation, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, bishop to d6 gave black a comfortable game. And yeah, which turned into a nice queen sacrifice after some inaccurate play by white. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one, and please don't forget to like and share, and I hope to see you on the next one.